Yeah, well, one of the things I think that Donald Trump overlooks is that this is a free market. And it's ironic, given that it's Donald Trump ignoring that, because that is perhaps his most driving central maxim. But yeah, the reality is that, this is a global trade in this sort of stuff. This is one of the hottest commodities that there is right now. It would be silly to think that actually there isn't a global trade in this, and that actually if someone wants something large enough and hard enough and strong enough, then they can get access to it, particularly if they're willing to pay the price.
Hello and welcome to the Tech Report. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Chris Stokel-Walker, a journalist and author who writes for many publications, including The Times. He also has a weekly segment with Jane and Fee on Times Radio. So for more from Chris, you can tune into Times Radio every Wednesday at about 3:15. Chris, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, the Trump administration has decided to allow Nvidia to carry on selling AI chips to China. What's the significance of this decision?
Well, this is huge because Nvidia is basically the de facto only choice that you have for AI chips nowadays. We call them AI chips, but they're really called GPUs, graphical processing units. Now, they were originally designed to improve computers' performance playing video games and things like that, but their ability to simultaneously handle lots of bits of information means that they have found a sort of second life and a much more lucrative life, by the way, in aiding the AI development of these models that we're starting to see all around the world and that are integrating their way into our lives. So without access to those NVIDIA chips, and particularly some of these high-end NVIDIA chips that we're talking about here, anyone trying to develop AI models would have a really hard time. They would have to use slightly inferior versions or versions that aren't developed by NVIDIA, which can complicate the process somewhat.
And these chips really have landed right at the center of this trade war between China and the United States, haven't they? Why did these chips become so important to Donald Trump, especially?
Well, they basically became a negotiating tool, a sort of way that he could bargain with the Chinese and try and find a way to eke out extra stuff. We've seen Trump isn't necessarily always that helpful in terms of negotiations. He seems to flip flop an awful lot, change his mind and try and renegotiate terms. We understand, of course, he did something similar with Sir Keir Starmer here in the UK at the very last minute, trying to edge in a little bit extra for the US in our own trade deal. And I think seeing China, he's recognized that this is vitally important to their future. These H20 chips, which by the way, were developed back in 2023 as a response to Joe Biden's attempt to instigate some sort of export ban of these chips to China. So already China was having to work with some difficult software and difficult hardware here. And I think basically Trump's realized that actually he can force China's hand in other ways. China has control of an awful lot of rare metals, which are important for GPU chip development, also for, frankly, other technology, including kind of the design of mobile phones. There was a threat and a worry that China would withhold that. Similarly, other computer chip-centric companies, there's one called Synopsys, which has been trying to negotiate the terms of an agreement for a merger with a competitor, which had been welcomed and accepted by lots of Western countries, but was being held up by China for a little bit. All of this is pawns in the game that Donald Trump is playing in terms of his negotiations with China. And I think he's managed to come to an agreement that he is happy with around those chips.
As you say, it's something of a give and take relationship, really, isn't it? I mean, the US needs these rare earth minerals from China and elsewhere. And I assume that those rare earth minerals are presumably used almost entirely for making these chips or similar tech products.
Yeah, this is the really complicated process of the supply chain of these GPU chips. Rare earths are used in lots of things, but they are crucial to the development of AI chips, GPUs. You often find that actually a GPU, a computer chip, will travel all the way around the world before it is actually produced. So you have the rare metals that are produced, they are unearthed in China and some other countries, although not many others around the world. They are then put into the chips. They are then carefully manufactured in some parts of China, but then they often have to go or rely on specialist manufacturing equipment that can get to the kind of very intricate levels that are required for the very highest level chips from EU companies. One of those is ASML, which is a very significant Dutch manufacturer of computer hardware manufacturing equipment. And then they will crisscross the globe many times more before they end up actually being used in these AI development tools that are being deployed by the likes of OpenAI, by X, by Google, and by many others, including, by the way, many Chinese companies of the likes that we've seen producing models like DeepSeek.
And have China got any alternatives or a way of circumventing those restrictions the US put on their chips? Is there any way for them to cut the US out of their supply chain?
They're certainly trying. So one of the ways that they are trying is China is big on its 5-year plans. One of its upcoming central cores of its next 5-year plan is to essentially try and onshore a lot of that capacity in terms of the fine tuning of this stuff that they are reliant on so many other countries for, and can come a cropper when it comes to sanctions. They are able to try and circumvent this in other ways. So we have seen allegations that China is able to source some of these higher level chips. We're talking about H20s here, which are now back on the table, but much more powerful chips are called the H100s, which are used by these Western AI labs. They've been getting access to those by trying to complicate the process of where they are supplied from. So maybe they transit through several countries, you lose track of where exactly they've come from, and they end up in China in Chinese AI labs to be used there. So there are a sort of range of different ways that China is trying to get around this. They are absolutely putting a lot more effort into the onshoring production process, in part because they're seeing all of their routes being siphoned off. Most recently, we saw this week Malaysia saying that it is going to limit the export of any chips to China whatsoever because it worries that it is being used as a kind of third country through which this stuff is being passed.
And you've mentioned specifically those H20 chips. Why are those chips at the center of this deal, and why are they so important for China and the US?
So these H20 chips, they're really, I suppose, a halfway house between the cutting edge chips that Western AI labs have access to and are able to use, and the much less powerful ones that otherwise China would have to rely on. So they were introduced as a way of trying to, I suppose, allow China to feel more comfortable in getting access to some GPU power while recognizing that actually they can't have access to the full fat stuff. So it's a little bit like, they don't necessarily have like a top end Ferrari, but they can have a sporty Mazda or something rather than just a kind of run around Ford Focus.
What is it that the US is so worried about with these chips? What do they think China is going to be using them for? Presumably, like many tech products, they can be used to create weapons. Is that the primary concern?
Yeah, I think that they are concerned about the weapons aspect, but I think it's also the soft power as well as the hard power. It's worth bearing in mind that around about 6 months ago, we saw the release of DeepSeek, the first major Chinese AI model that really transformed and upended the whole world. It caused chaos in financial markets as people started to reckon with the idea that actually a lot of these Western AI labs, they don't necessarily hold the whip hand in this race. And I think there is a concern here amongst Western countries that actually, if you give China enough high powered chips, they can put them to good work to develop really cutting edge models that could either compete with or could better Western ones. And I think the worry here is that if you start to use Chinese AI models rather than maybe some Western ones, then those AI models are encoded with sort of cultural, societal values that might be the antithesis of what particularly some of those more hawkish American politicians really want the world to be imbued with.
Is there a chance that this policy of trying to restrict which chips go where from the US can backfire to an extent? I mean, if China has the resources, they have those rare earth minerals already that they need to make these things. How far are they from just being able to simply make their own chips at home with their own raw materials?
Depending on who you ask, there are very different answers to that question. So Some people say that China is around about a year behind, but is catching up very quickly. Some people say that they're only a matter of months behind. But in this world, that is not a lot of time. If you think about the kind of huge advancements that we've had over the last couple of years alone since the release of ChatGPT in November 2022. So I think there is a real concern here that in trying to shut out China, you start to lose control of what they're actually doing. And that allows them to go down a parallel or a different path that might be more significant in terms of its blowback to us. So there is an argument, I think, to say that you should keep your enemies closer than your friends in this instance. And I think there is a worry that by empowering China or forcing China almost to develop this expertise by itself, you run the risk of not being able to kind of pull back on the leash if you think that they're going too far. So it is a real concern. It is one that I think a lot of experts in this field are very much worried about. And unfortunately, I think now the die has been cast. There has been some softening of relations between China and the US. The fact that these H-20s are now fair game for China is significant in and of itself. But truthfully, I think China's seen, well, you have threatened to shut off this path once before, and we're worried that you're going to do it again. So screw you, we're going to do it ourselves anyway.
And building on that, does China have the capability to just reverse engineer the chips they're already getting from the US or have already got from the US?
Well, this is always the big question. With any sort of technology, the fear is that once you get it in the hands of an adversarial state, as many people think China is, then there is the risk that they simply just copy that and then advance on that. Chinese manufacturing is really highly developed, very highly skilled. It is excellent at what it does, and we know that they are almost there. It's that kind of just a very high precision aspect that they are currently missing. I think it would be naive to think that they aren't looking at this very carefully under a microscope and thinking, well, how can I do this myself?
Well, yeah, and I mean, on the other side of that, the restrictions that were put on this year do seem to have actually been quite damaging for the two major US chip manufacturers, AMD and Nvidia.
Yeah, they've had huge impacts in terms of their share price. Now, worth putting this into context, Nvidia still doing incredibly well, still the world's most valuable company, still topped $4 trillion in market capitalization, something no company has ever done before this week. So, not to feel too sorry for them, but yes, I think there is this risk. And one of the things that's been particularly interesting around this is Jensen Huang, the CEO of Nvidia, has basically been saying, well, this is futile anyway. They are going to get access to this, so you may as well just give them the opportunity to do so, because ultimately all you're doing is harming American interests and potentially pushing a foe further into their foxhole so that you can never really engage with them in a time when possibly we need to get closer together rather than further apart.
And as if to reinforce that, Trump is having a bit of a problem here, that he's gone to the Gulf and he's done a lot of these trade deals with partners there, especially with the UAE over chips and technology. If those chips are traded to countries like that, there's every reason to believe they will eventually be traded or something similar back to the Chinese, won't they, once they're on the world market?
Yeah, well, one of the things I think that Donald Trump overlooks is that this is a free market. It's ironic, given that it's Donald Trump ignoring that, because that is perhaps his most driving central maxim. But yeah, the reality is that, this is a global trade in this sort of stuff. This is one of the hottest commodities that there is right now. It would be silly to think that actually there isn't a global trade in this, and that actually, if someone wants something large enough and hard enough and strong enough, then they can get access to it, particularly if they're willing to pay the price.
Well, Chris Stokel-Walker, thank you very much for joining me today on the Tech Report.
Thank you.